Okay, time to finish the 14th chapter of Over Sea Under Stone. It is a tense moment. The kids are surrounded by water on one side, two dinghies on the other. Both Mr. Penhallow and Mr. Hastings are heading toward them, and here we pick up. "Put it down, Barnabas," Mr. Hastings panted. "Put down the manuscript, or I'll break his arm." Simon wriggled in his grasp and kicked backwards, but then gasped and went limp as his arm was jerked savagely higher and pain shot through him like water boiling in his blood. But before Barney, his face twisted with concern, could even move, a great yell rang out over the water from the yacht. A rough voice shouted in anguished warning, "Master!" In the same moment they heard a new noise over the low throb of the yacht's waiting engines, a high-pitched drone that grew louder and nearer. Suddenly, round the corner of the headland from Trewissick, they saw a glittering arc of spray shooting up from the bows of a big speedboat. It was moving tremendously fast, swinging out around the seaward side of the yacht toward the place where they stood. And in a glimpse through the spray, they saw the only figure they knew that could tower as tall as Mr. Hastings. And above it, the familiar blowing tousle of white hair. Jane let out a shout with relief. "It's Gummery!" Mr. Hastings snarled and released Simon suddenly, making a desperate lunge forward at Barney where he stood, wavering on the edge. Just in time, Barney saw him and ducked away backward under his hand. Bill, in his dinghy, ripped at the outboard motor and set it roaring, then jumped, slithering on the rocks, but landing safe, chunky and menacing, beside the giant height of the man in black. He faced them, crouching slightly. Like dancers in a minuet, the two moved forward, groping slowly for the treacherous footholds, and the children shrank back against the cliff. The speedboat roared up in a great flurry of spray. Within seconds it was alongside the headland. The engine's note changed to a deeper throb, and the boat lurched slowly closer. Looking fearfully over Bill's advancing shoulder, Jane could see Great-Uncle Mary standing erect beside the blue-jerseyed figure of Mr. Penhallow, crouching over the controls. Forgetting everything in the overwhelming surge of relief, she dashed forward to the edge of the rocks, taking the boy by surprise, so that he grasped at her too late and overbalanced against Mr. Hastings. The man snarled at him angrily and made a last reach for Barney as he stood pressed and staring helplessly against the cliff, his arms hanging down, now limp. But Simon, twisting up the last of his strength, snatched the Grail and the long cylinder of the telescope case from his brother and slipped out of reach, dodging round him to the edge of the waves. He shouted urgently, "Gummery!" As his great-uncle turned, he raised his arm and flung the Grail with all his might toward the speedboat, watching agonized to see if it could cross the gap. At the controls, Mr. Penhallow wrestled to hold the boat steady. The strange bell-like cup wheeled through the air, flashing golden in the sun, and Great-Uncle Mary shot out one arm sideways like a slip fielder, and caught it as it curved over toward the water. "Look out!" Barney yelled. Mr. Hastings pivoted toward Simon as he drew back his arm to send the manuscript after the cup. Darting sideways to keep out of reach, he threw. But as the case left his hand, Mr. Withers, dripping to his feet in the dinghy, lunged out with an oar in a clumsy attempt to intercept it. Jane screamed. The oar struck the case in mid-flight. Withers let out a shout of triumph, but in his throat it changed to terror as the long, unwieldy case spun off the oar with the force of Simon's throw and came apart in the air. The two halves spiraled out away from the boat, scattering fragments of the familiar manuscript that they had studied so often. They saw the small lead case from the cave fall out and splash like a stone into the sea. And almost at the same moment the two halves of the telescope case, with their disintegrating parchment, hit the water and disappeared. The broken pieces of parchment did not float. They were gone at once, as if they had dissolved. Nothing was left but Jane's handkerchief, bobbing forlornly on the waves. And then their blood stood still and cold within them, as an inhuman sound like the howl of an animal rang out over the sea. It was the second long howl they had heard that day, but it was not the same as the first. Mr. Hastings put back his head like a dog and gave a great shriek of pain and fear and rage. With two long bounds he leapt from the edge of the rocks and dived with a mighty splash into the rippled water where the case had gone down. They stared at the sunlight dancing on the water that had closed over his head. But for the mutter of the engines and the sea there was no sound. A movement by the yacht caught their gaze, and they saw the girl being pulled aboard with her dinghy left bobbing below. Bill stood as immobile as the children, gazing open-mouthed at the sea, turning golden now under the late sun. Then Withers shouted at him, lurching toward the outboard motor in the remaining dinghy.